Hey, thanks for listening to my presentation. This is a talk that I gave on December 2nd in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, at a convening of the Informal Ed to Higher Ed group organized by Mark Lesser and others at Mouse Inc. I was asked to talk about the research that we'd carried out at Indiana University Center for Research on Learning and Technology starting back in 2012. So we hope you find this useful. Happy to hear from you. These are just a few of the collaborators and partners who we worked with on this project. In particular, I want to recognize project coordinator James Willis and project coordinator Nate Otto, who started out on this work, and the collaborators, many collaborators at Haystack and Mozilla. Of course, I want to say thank you to sponsors, primarily MacArthur. I can't say enough about the generous support. Mimi Ito and Connie Owell have been tremendous in supporting this work over the years. Some of the insights here also came by way of a grant from Google, big open online course I'll talk about that Google funded in 2014, but also some really important early funding from the IU Office of the Vice President for Information Technology. So the first paper I want to talk about is from 2015. This paper outlined a way of thinking about different research designs. I'm starting with this paper because that's one of the reasons that we pulled this convening together, was to talk about ways of organizing the research. In this chapter, we cross the traditional distinctions between summative research, more naturalistic studies of what's happened, formative research, more interventionist research on relatively modest systems. I call this research for badges rather than research of badges. And then finally, transformative studies, where you're really trying to transform larger educational ecosystems. So this is really research for ecosystems that include badges. So if you add the distinction of the fact that badges contain evidence, this is a really new thing. A lot of people don't really appreciate what it means to say that if you're going to do research on learning, well, most learning research requires some sort of evidence of learning. And the fact that well-designed badges should contain actual evidence of learning means that you can use that evidence in studying that learning. And this really requires some careful thought and some careful research design, but it really does give you three entirely different kinds of studies. I will say that in 2015, there were only a handful of examples of studies using evidence in badges, and most of these were research with badges and of badges using the evidence in the badges. There were a couple of the Category 5 where people were using the evidence in badges to improve their badge system. And I don't think there were any examples of Cell 6 where people were using the evidence in badges as evidence in studies of entire ecosystems. But you can see the point. This review really needs to be updated. I'd love to have a collaborator who's interested in scouring the really voluminous research literature that has been published since 2015 and organize it into this kind of a framework. I also think that this study overlooked, I've come to really appreciate, thanks to my colleagues in the design field, that the designs themselves are a form of research and that those are worthy of really publication and sharing on their own. There's several journals that are dedicated to publication of educational designs in and of themselves, regardless of the evidence. So I think I'd add to that a seventh category of simple talking about badge designs. The second paper I want to talk about is really, for me, a really important idea that came from Carla Casilli when I read in a really early blog post. I'd yet to meet Carla, but I was introduced to her in a blog post that she published in 2012. She was deeply involved in Mozilla very early on. And, I'm an assessment person, and I study validity a lot in my work, and I know that there's some debate, but for instance, my textbook in my assessment class from Jim Popham says that face validity is an unsanctioned form of validity. And Carla challenged this in her blog post. And by the end of her blog post, she had really convinced me that the open recognition made possible by open digital badges circulating in open networks where people can interrogate that data, add more meaning to that evidence, really requires to move or either extend or even supplant measurement models of validity with newer models of credibility. And Carla pointed to P.J. Fogg's work on information credibility and talks about presumed credibility, surface credibility, reputed, and earned. And I think those are all really important and they need to be considered. So that was a really helpful insight that Carla had. And I added some things, extended that, and brought in what that means in the assessment literature. This is the final report of the Design Principles Documentation Project. So we were funded to study what became of the 30 projects that were funded in 2012 and the implicit design principles that were in those proposals. And this was really a very naturalistic study, of where badges work better. This report outlines sort of some general design principles for badge systems, but then 4 categories of very specific badge design principles in terms of recognizing, assessing, motivating, and studying learning. Now, at the end of this study, at the advice of Mimi Ito, as this whole entire project is winding down, she strongly encouraged me to just go back and figure out what became of the different categories of studies and to categorize the studies. In the end, my team concluded that we were able to talk about really 4 different kinds of badge systems. Competency-based badge systems that really implicitly embrace a more associationist model of learning, completion-based badge systems that were inquiry, and project-based badges that are really badges were awarded typically for completing projects or investigations, participation-based systems where people were earning badges for participating in interactive social practices and where badges were kind of crowdsourced and that was implicitly sociocultural practices. And then finally, hybrid systems that had all 3 of those kinds of badges. And as we reported in a paper that was just published in Education and Information Technologies, this gave us some interesting findings. We can see that the associationist practices, those are the so-called competency-based badges, only one of them was still thriving a year after the funding had dried up, and that was really just buzz math. That was didn't even have open badges. It was a math drill and kill practice math site. The more project-based constructivist projects that featured completion badges, they were more mixed. Most of those that succeeded did so really by dialing back their assessment expectations. And so, and similarly with the hybrid practices, results were mixed, but the ones that were thriving were really the ones, for instance, Chris Shun's hybrid project. It had a bunch of automated assessment built into it. So the main thing throughout these projects is that all of them made very ambitious plans about how much assessment they were going to carry out, particularly the competency-based badges made some really very, very ambitious goals about getting people to look at work that students had done and make judgments about very specific competencies. And they really just expected an awful lot out of educational ecosystems in terms of assessment of individual work. In contrast, the participation-based badges that were more embraced more sociocultural approaches to learning, there were fewer of them, but ones like Mouse Inc. and other ones that used that crowdsourced a lot of the badges. The badges are really more awarded not for attending things, which sometimes are called participation badges, but for participating in socially networked learning. So I thought that's a big takeaway from this project, that the evidence was pretty clear that the participation badges had a lot going for them, and they take advantage of the unique features of open digital badges. In 2017, In 2017, an important thing happened, and that was that on January 1, the Open Badges 2.0 standards were released. Nate Otto, Kerry Lamar were very deeply involved in doing them. And there's a lot of technical stuff in them that I don't fully understand, but what I do understand was that they included Endorsement 2.0. And this is something that we have been talking about in the badges community for a long, long time. This article in EDUCAUSE Review explains how Endorsement 2.0 went well beyond Open Badges 1.1. That set of metadata standards had a single field for issuer, and whatever name was put into the issuer field, whatever name or organization, that's the data that when someone looked at a badge would appear when it would say issuer, and that was implicitly the endorser of the badge. So Endorsement 2.0 allowed third-party endorsement where someone other than the issuer could add their endorsement, and this could happen in two ways at two levels. First, before the badge is issued to someone, the so-called badge class, the issuer could insert the name of a person, or more likely an organization, into the endorser field, and that endorser could add a statement that would explain what was the nature of their endorsement, right? So when that badge was issued, when the so-called assertion of the badge was generated, technically what that means is that an image file of the badge was generated that contained the data in the image file. So that would contain the name of the organization, a link back to the profile for that organization. I believe that's where that actual endorsing statement lives. I don't know if that lives in the badge or not. Anyways, the important distinction is that when the assertion of that badge class was generated, in other words, that badge was issued to someone whose name appeared in the image of the badge, it was still possible for the issuer to have arranged for someone who's qualified, perhaps a member of the organization that endorsed the badge class, for someone to add their name, presumably of the person, after looking at the evidence contained in the badge, and add an endorsing statement. So this is a really, really big development. I believe it's a huge development. We're still trying to get it figured out what this looks like. There's only a handful of people who have gotten this right. I'd like to rewrite this paper someday soon, looking at those examples. So in 2017, a little later in the year, I was so enthused about the potential of Endorsement 2.0 and the implications that I wrote this editorial for the Chronicle of Higher Education. In it, I traced the parallels between e-credentials in 2017 with e-commerce in 1997. In 1997, the standards for web payments were about 4 years old, and many people were dismissing e-commerce as kind of a fad. Well, something important happened after 2000, and that is consumer reviews. After the crash in 2000, it took 7 or 8 years for consumer reviews to become sufficiently numerous and trustworthy to develop the ecosystem of trust, the trust network that allowed e-commerce to really begin flourishing. Well, I believe that in 2017, we're at a similar place. The standards for e-credentials were 4 or 5 years old, and but the broader trust network that needed to allow e-credentials to flourish was just beginning to set in. I believe that endorsements are going to do the same for e-credentials as consumer reviews did for e-commerce. If this is true, people who are currently dismissing e-credentials as a fad are really behaving an awful lot like people back in the late 90s, people like Borders and Sears, who were dismissing e-commerce as a fad and who either never got into e-commerce or got in so late that they completely couldn't make it happen. So in 2013, I got a grant from Google to take my assessment in schools course that I'd been teaching for online for about 5 years at that time, to use Google Course Builder, a nice, clean course management platform that Google had developed, and to offer not a MOOC, but a BOOC, a big open online course. I knew that I could scale up my course and automate a bunch of features for hundreds of students. I wasn't quite ready for thousands, but I also was pretty sure that I could make an early example of endorsement before we got it into the metadata standards. We could custom program it into this course, and we did, and I was really happy with the way it went. We talk about sort of peer endorsement and peer promotion and the difference between those two. And this project, I think, showed that endorsement and participation badges scale really nicely. By the end, by 2016, after we had programmed in and automated some of the features, like badge issuing and notifications, I was able to add hundreds of additional learners to a fully online course that I was teaching for credit with really no additional effort on my part, including these issuing of some pretty impressive badges. And in this case, the badges that were issued, if you completed all 3 of the course modules and earned the expert badge, that badge contained the 3 module badges. The 3 module badges contained virtually all of the work that you had completed in the course, including all of the comments and all of the discussions of your completed assignments, and it displayed all of the peer promotions that you had earned, both at the top of the assignments as well as in the aggregated form at different levels of badges. So that was a really exciting development for me. So along the way, I've had to contend with this continual argument that, oh, badges are just extrinsic motivators. And my advice in this chapter, the Cambridge Handbook of Motivation and Learning, is then don't use them that way. Just don't use them that way. There are people who are using badges as tokens in gamified systems of learning. The BuzzMath program I talked about earlier certainly is doing that. If you have a problem with those kinds of things and drill and practice with tokens and games, then don't do it. But this chapter argues that even if you do, it might not be as bad as people think it is, but there are ways to not do it. So essentially what we argue here is that digital badges are inherently more meaningful than the extrinsic tokens that have been shown in dozens of studies to undermine intrinsic motivation and things that kids are already interested in, the so-called over-justification effect. The circulation makes open badges particularly meaningful and therefore less likely to be perceived as arbitrary and extrinsic. Furthermore, the unique features of digital open badges and the ability, for instance, to add likes and perhaps dislikes to them, all of these things mean that an open badge is less likely to be perceived as an arbitrary extrinsic reward. However, even if students do perceive them that way, it's my opinion that because of more cultural models of motivation and neurological models of motivation, it's possible that the motivating, the endorphins associated with neurological consequence of reward and the sort of crowdsourced motivation, when you think about rewards and incentives from a situative perspective, they may well overwhelm and do away with any negative consequences of the over-justification effect. So I have a little bit of research supporting part of that argument, but I certainly think this is where we need to go in studies of incentives in the context of badges. Ideally, using the evidence contained inside of those badges, as I talked about in my first slide. More generally, I think that considerations of a motivation in badges should really focus primarily on the social consequences of badge systems, and then secondarily on their consequences for individual behavior and individual cognition. So this is a chapter that should be going to press really literally any day. I'm expecting to see the galleys for this. So this was an interesting one in the latest version of this handbook that MJ Bishop led the editing team on. MJ approached me about adding a chapter on badges, but she said she wanted it to be different, that they're doing something different at AECT, and that is that rather than focusing on technologies, they're focusing on problems. And so what I do in this chapter is talk about the problem that open badges are trying to solve. So I start by leading with the efforts of the Lumina Foundation and this vast enterprise taking place really across the world of trying to deal with the problem of the fact that existing recognition and credentialing and measurement systems are really opaque and transparent and resistant to change. And so we're really trying to move from measuring achievement to assessing learning, from credentialing graduates to capturing learning, and from accrediting schools to endorsing learning. So I use the badges from my assessment book to illustrate each of these points for convenience, but also because it really was the only example of endorsement that we had at that point. And I'd really, really love to rewrite this chapter with a group of people, perhaps, with a bunch of other badge systems, and provide illustrations of what each of these things mean. What I believe here is that open badges have potential to accomplish these transformative functions, for instance, from measuring achievement to capturing learning. So there you can see there are 4 different kinds of functions of open badges that clearly have transformative potential, and in many cases have already shown that they can transform learning ecosystems. And that's what I really mean by the title of this talk, Macro Impact. A lot of people are really, they were promised a lot of things by open badges, and yeah, sure, it hasn't completely transformed credentialing. Of course not. I mean, it took a century for the existing credentialing system to turn into this ossified, opaque behemoth that is really obstructing change. But it really is causing transformations, and I was able to provide some nice examples of each of these functions in terms of from going towards capturing learning, recognizing learning, and endorsing learning. So I'd really like to rewrite this chapter with colleagues. I hope somebody's interested in it. Here's a few others that some of you may find interesting. In particular, I'd like to point to the very first one that James Willis wrote. James is an ethicist, and really he's a theologian, he's a religious scholar by training, and I think he did a really great job in that chapter talking about ethics. I think there's some very important questions that need to be seriously considered when it comes to the ethics of open digital badges. With that, thanks for listening to my talk. I hope you found it interesting. You, of course, feel free to email me. I'm at dthickey@indiana.edu. Happy to hear from you. Thanks a lot.